Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something a little different. This isn't about battles or betrayals or blood-soaked history that makes you question humanity's survival instincts. No, tonight is for winding down, for drifting off, for learning how people in ancient times handled the most boring parts of life so you can finally fall asleep while listening to someone talk about Roman plumbing. If you're here for the first time, thanks for clicking. If you're back from the Viking torture series, wow, I didn't expect you to survive that, but here you are. Before we begin, take a second to like this video if you actually enjoy the sound of calm narration and historical trivia that feels like ASMR, but with waste. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes, because yes, there will be more daily episodes. Much more, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who's up late around the world surviving on tea and curiosity. All right, lights out, eyes heavy, voice low. Let's go to sleep with boring history for sleep, how ancient Romans went to the bathroom, and more. All right, let's start at the very beginning. You wake up in the year 127 AD. It's dark, quiet. You can hear birds chirping outside, somewhere beyond the stone walls of your modest apartment. Your head feels groggy, your mouth dry, your limbs stiff from sleeping on a thin straw mattress stuffed inside a wooden bed frame. There's no pillow, no sheets, just a wool blanket, rough as tree bark, and not quite warm enough to stop your toes from going numb. Welcome to morning in ancient Rome, where waking up doesn't mean peace, it means noise. Outside, the city is already alive. Shops are opening. Merchants shout prices. Donkeys bray under the weight of produce. Somewhere down the street, a baker is feeding dough into an oven, sending waves of heat and bread smell through the narrow alleys. But before you even open your eyes fully, you feel it. That familiar, urgent pressure, the need to go now, because yes, today, we're starting with something truly boring, and yet something every human has done since the dawn of time. We're talking about how people went to the bathroom in ancient Rome. Not the dramatic stuff, not chariot races or gladiator fights, just the daily grind, the simple act of urinating and relieving yourself, Roman style. So let's follow our protagonist, that's you, through the day. You sit up slowly, joints cracking like old wood in a storm. You scratch your beard, yawn, and finally plant both feet on the cold floor. Stone, damp, possibly sticky. No socks, no slippers, just bare skin meeting whatever grime settled overnight. You stumble toward the door of your room, if you even have a separate room. Many Romans didn't. They lived in tiny apartments called insulae, stacked 5 stories high, filled with families, animals, and the occasional rat that definitely saw you naked last week. But today, you don't care about privacy. Because, right, now nature is calling louder than your neighbor's rooster. You reach the hallway. Maybe there's a chamber pot. Maybe not. Either way, it's not clean. And it probably hasn't been washed since the last time someone forgot to empty it. But you've got bigger concerns, because in ancient Rome, relieving yourself wasn't just a personal experience. It was often a public one. Yes, public bathrooms were a thing, and they looked like long benches with holes carved into them. No dividers, no toilet paper, just a row of men sitting side by side, sharing a shared hygiene tool used in public latrines. Welcome to the world of Roman sanitation. This isn't glamorous, this isn't heroic, but it's real. And if you're looking for a story without swords, blood, or betrayal, well, here's one with piss, waste, and pigeons. Because in Rome, even bathrooms had class systems. Rich folks had private latrines, poor folks shared. And everyone used urine jars, chamber pots, or the nearest gutter. In fact, many Romans just tossed their waste out the window. If you've ever heard of someone yelling guarda l'acqua in Italian, meaning watch out for the water, that Phrase came from ancient Rome. Back then, people shouted a warning before dumping their buckets into the street. Sometimes they remembered. Sometimes they didn't, and sometimes someone died from being peed on, literally. There are records of people being crushed, burned, or stabbed while relieving themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. One man was allegedly killed when a tragic accident occurred involving a falling object. Another was found dead after falling into a pit latrine during a blackout caused by too much wine. But let's get back to your morning. You make it to the latrine, whether it's in your home, your neighborhood block, or a public bathhouse. The stench hits you first. A mix of vinegar, sweat, and something that smells suspiciously like sulfur. There's no air freshener, no candles, no essential oils, just a small hole in the ground carved into marble or stone with a bench wide enough for several people. You take your seat. No privacy. No separation. Just silence broken by the sound of other men doing exactly what you're doing. Because, yes, Roman bathrooms were social hubs. People talked politics, gossiped about senators, shared recipes, all while sitting in a row like a line of ducks waiting for fate to decide who goes first. There's no toilet paper. Instead, you reach for the tersorium, a communal sponge mounted on a stick, soaked in a bucket of salt water or vinegar. You wipe carefully, then return the sponge to the same bucket everyone else uses. Now imagine that. Every time you use the bathroom, you're sharing a sponge stick with strangers. And that's not the worst part, because in Rome, disease spread fast. Parasites were everywhere. Lice clung to your tunic. Fungal infections grew between your toes. But, hey, at least you're not wiping with your hand and hoping for the best. That's what most other cultures did. The Greeks, the Celts, the Germans, even some Egyptians. Romans, though, they had plumbing, they had sewers, they had public toilets with running water underneath. Yes, some Roman bathrooms flushed, sort of. Aqueduct-fed water ran beneath the seats, carrying away waste into underground channels. Of course, it didn't always work. Blockages were common. Smells lingered. Flies swarmed like they owned the place. Still, compared to other civilizations, Rome was ahead of its time, and now, after your early morning bathroom ritual, you stand up, you wash your hands, maybe. In a basin fed by aqueducts, you splash a bit of water on your face, and prepare for the rest of your day, which, believe it or not, only gets slightly less gross, so you've survived the bathroom, barely. You washed your hands in water that may or may not have been blessed by the gods, or just full of parasites. And now it's time for breakfast. Welcome to morning in ancient Rome, where breakfast isn't about taste, nutrition, or even hunger. It's about survival, because today, like every day, you're going to eat something that might kill you. Let's see. Step into the Roman kitchen, if you can call it that. Your home is modest. Maybe a small apartment above a shop, maybe a rented room with a view of a sewer. Either way, there's no fridge humming in the corner, no toaster, no coffee machine, just a brazier, some clay pots, and yesterday's leftovers that may or may not still be alive. Breakfast wasn't fancy. In fact, most Romans considered it optional. If you could afford food in the morning, great. If not, too bad. The elite had servants to prepare meals. The middle class? You're on your own. Your options are simple. Bread, cheese, olives, eggs, if they weren't stolen. Wine, because water was poison. Yes, that's it. No eggs Benedict, no croissants, definitely no espresso, just bread soaked in wine or porridge made from spelt, barley, or wheat, boiled until it became a thick, lumpy paste that stuck to your ribs more than your memory. And if you were really lucky, a bit of cheese, not brie, not cheddar, just something hard, salty, and possibly moldy from sitting too long in a clay jar. But here's the kicker. Even if you didn't feel like eating, you did anyway, because breakfast wasn't about fueling your day. It was about making sure you didn't die before noon. Let's talk about what actually went into your bowl or your hand. Bread was the staple of Roman life. Every class ate it. Rich, poor, slave, citizen, everyone. But not all bread was created equal. The lower classes got coarse, dark loaves filled with bran, grit, and sometimes sand. Yes, sand. Because stone mills ground the grain so roughly that bits of rock and dust mixed right into the flour. Imagine chewing bread that slowly grinds down your teeth like a primitive form of dentistry. By age 40, Roman jaws were worn smooth from years of this. For the rich, they had soft white bread, expensive, imported, and often baked in private kitchens by slaves who probably envied your dental pain. Then came cheese, usually goat or sheep, because cow's milk was harder to come by. Cheese was preserved, with salt stored in jars and sometimes soaked in honey or brine. It wasn't gourmet, but it was protein. Next up, eggs, olives, and fruit when in season. Eggs were common but not scrambled. They were boiled, roasted, or fried in oil. If you were wealthy enough to afford it, olives were everywhere, salted, pickled, or stuffed, with spices if you were fancy. Romans loved them. They packed lunches with them. They drank olive oil like it was medicine. Fruit, figs, dates, apples, pears, whatever was ripe and hadn't already been offered to Jupiter at the local temple. And then, the real breakfast drink, not coffee, not tea, wine. Romans drank wine at every meal, including breakfast. And not just any wine, it was diluted, mixed with water, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, often sour. Because fermentation wasn't precise, some batches turned into vinegar overnight. Others tasted like someone left grapes in a swamp for a week. Still, wine was safer than water. And that's saying something. Water in Rome was drawn from public fountains, aqueducts, or wells, all of which were downstream from sewage, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. So, yes, you started your day with alcohol. Because in ancient Rome, sobriety was dangerous. Now let's talk about how this diet affected you. Spoiler alert, it didn't make you healthy. Most Romans suffered from tooth decay, digestive issues, and nutritional imbalances. Without fresh vegetables, without dairy quality control, and without proper cooking techniques, malnutrition was common, especially among the lower classes. Children were stunted. Adults suffered from vitamin deficiencies. Iron deficiency led to fatigue, weakness, and anemia. But hey, at least you weren't drinking from the Tiber River. That thing was basically a liquid garbage dump. Fishermen pulled out dead animals. Kids played with floating turds. Merchants rinsed off their goods in it. If you wanted clean water, you bought it from a public fountain, assuming you had coins to spare. Otherwise, you filtered it through charcoal, boiled it over fire, or prayed. Hard while sipping, because in Rome, hydration was a gamble. And food? Even worse. You sit down or squat near the hearth, holding a wooden bowl of porridge or a hunk of bread soaked in wine. You chew slowly. Your jaw aches. Your stomach growls louder than your neighbor's dog. There's no seasoning unless you count salt, and even that was taxed heavily during certain periods. Garlic? Rare? Pepper? Imported from India at ridiculous cost. Honey? Only for the rich. You're lucky if your food doesn't taste like despair, but at least you're not starving. Starvation was real in Rome, especially during famines caused by war, drought, or political incompetence. During times of crisis, the government gave out free grain through a system called the cura annoni, the grain dole. This program kept the poor from rioting by handing out monthly rations of wheat or bread, but getting your share meant standing in line for hours, dealing with corrupt officials, and praying you didn't get stabbed over a stale bun. Yes, riots broke out over food distribution. People died fighting for bread, and that's why the emperor made sure to keep the people fed, not out of kindness, but out of fear, because hungry Romans, they didn't just complain, they revolted. So you finish your breakfast, if you can. Call it that. You brush your fingers against your teeth, feeling the rough edges of decay forming like tiny craters, No toothpaste, no toothbrush. Just a stick, some ash, and maybe a pinch of salt. You rinse with wine or water, whichever one doesn't smell like death, and with that, you're ready to face the rest of your day, because after breakfast comes work. And trust me, it's not going to be better. So, you've survived the bathroom. Barely. You wiped with a communal sponge stick and now question every life choice, and then washed it off in water that may or may not have been blessed by Jupiter, but definitely had fleas in it. Your breakfast was soaked in wine because clean water was a death sentence. Your teeth are decaying like a forgotten amphitheater wall, and your stomach is still trying to decide if that porridge was food or poison. Now, after morning routines that felt more like survival training than hygiene, it's time for what every modern person fears: work. Welcome to Roman office life, where productivity didn't come from caffeine, spreadsheets, or motivational posters. It came from whips, deadlines set by emperors, and the ever-present threat of being sold into slavery if you missed payroll. Let's step into the forum. The sun is up. The streets are already packed with merchants, hawking fish, slaves carrying amphorae, and senators whispering behind their togas like they're planning your downfall. You're not heading to a cubicle. You're heading to a stone bench covered in wax tablets, scrolls, and ink pots that smell suspiciously like goat blood. Because yes, this is the Roman version of an office. And today, you're working as either a scribe, a clerk, or maybe even a senator if you were born lucky enough to afford sandals that don't leak sand. But let's start at the bottom. The scribes, the ancient world's version of data entry clerks. They sat cross-legged on wooden stools, scratching, away with styluses on wax-covered boards, recording everything from grain shipments to legal disputes. No keyboards, no paper, just wax, papyrus, and the occasional scroll made of dried plant pulp that could crumble under pressure. Imagine spending your entire workday writing so slowly that you developed chronic neck pain from leaning over all day. And when someone finally asked how your back was doing, well, they probably didn't ask. They just assumed you were suffering, because everyone did. For those who couldn't read or write, which was about 90% of the population, you relied on scribes to handle contracts, wills, and official documents. Some worked for the government. Others served wealthy patrons. All of them lived with ink-stained fingers, stiff wrists, and the constant fear of making a typo that got someone executed. Because, in Rome, clerical errors weren't just embarrassing. They could be deadly. One misplaced name, one misspelled law, one smudged wax tablet, and suddenly you weren't just fired. You were exiled, or crucified, or thrown into the arena to fight a badger. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you get the point. Now let's talk about the Roman bureaucracy. Because yes, even in antiquity, paperwork ruled everything. If you were a minor official, you spent your days copying census records, tax rolls, and land deeds. If you were lucky, you had access to a tabularium, a government archive where clerks sorted scrolls like they were playing a game of bureaucratic Jenga. No filing cabinets, no shredders, no recycling bins, just clay jars filled with brittle. Scrolls and slaves trying not to sneeze in the dust cloud of history. And if you lost a document, hope you can explain why Emperor Trajan's shipment of olive oil vanished between Sicily and Ostia without leaving a paper trail. Because losing important documents in ancient Rome meant prison, exile, or worse, being reassigned to a sanitation crew in Pompeii? Yes, that was a real job. Roman sanitation workers, basically glorified janitors who cleaned public latrines and maintained aqueduct drains. They were paid slightly better than field slaves, but only because no one else wanted the job. These workers shoveled out waste pits, unclogged sewer channels, and sometimes dived headfirst into open sewers to remove blockages. No gloves, no masks, just a tunic, a shovel, and a prayer to Mercury, god of commerce, and apparently plumbing. Then there were the tax collectors, or publicani, as they were known. Forget debt collectors today. These guys were terrifying. They operated as private contractors, often bidding for the right to collect taxes in certain regions. Their job wasn't to be fair, it was to make money. So if you owed 10 denarii, guess what? You might owe 20 by the time they were done auditing your farm. And if you couldn't pay, well, they had ways of getting creative. Some collected livestock, others took land. A few were rumored to take body parts, because in Rome, missing payments wasn't a financial issue, it was a physical one. Now, let's imagine what it was like if you actually had an office job and you were rich enough to avoid manual labor. Welcome to the world of the Roman elite. Senators, magistrates, and bureaucrats gathered in marble halls to discuss laws, trade routes, and the latest scandal involving the emperor's nephew. Meetings started early, around sunrise. There were no Zoom calls, no coffee, no pastries. Just debate, politics, and the occasional dagger hidden beneath a toga. Roman meetings were brutal. They argued in porticos, colonnades, and public squares, often while walking. Because, yes, some of the most important decisions in history were made while pacing back and forth across dusty courtyards. And if you were a senator, you brought your own chair, sat on it like a throne, talked loudly, interrupted people, threw shade like it was bread to pigeons. There was no HR department, no anti-harassment policy, just power dynamics, political alliances, and the occasional poisoned wine. And yet, despite the lack of technology, Romans got things done. They built roads, conquered provinces, managed massive armies, ruled an empire that spanned 3 continents. How? With organization and discipline, and a whole lot of slaves, because yes, the Roman office ran on slavery. Not just manual labor, but intellectual help. Household slaves managed accounts, wrote letters, dictated schedules, and even helped draft speeches. They were trained from childhood, often Greek-educated, and surprisingly powerful within the system. Good slave secretary could hold more influence than a freeborn clerk, and if they played their cards right, they could earn freedom, wealth, and eventually become Roman citizens themselves. Talk about career growth. Now let's talk about tools. Because yes, even without laptops or printers, Romans had systems. Wax tablets were the Roman laptop, reusable, erasable, practical. You scratched notes with a stylus, then smoothed the surface with the flat end when you needed to rewrite. Papyrus scrolls were the Roman PDF file. Delicate, expensive, and prone to catching fire during candlelit meetings. Ink was made from squid, iron gall, or just plain charcoal mixed with vinegar. And if you wanted to store information long-term, you carved it into stone. That's right. Important decrees, laws, and imperial proclamations were literally chiseled into walls, monuments, and statues. It was the original form of data backup, permanent, unchangeable, and impossible to delete. So, whether you were a poor scribe, a middle-class clerk, or a wealthy senator, work in Rome was a mix of endurance, intellect, and social maneuvering. There was no lunch break, no nap pods, no ergonomic chairs. There was only parchment pressure and the looming threat of being dragged into court over a miswritten ledger. And after 8 hours of this, you called it a day, because even in ancient Rome, productivity had limits. The sun dipped low. The forum emptied. The bureaucrats went home, and you finally had a moment to breathe. Because next up is something we all crave after a hard day of writing on wax and dodging political assassins. So you've made it through the morning, you've wiped with a sponge stick, eaten bread that could double as sandpaper, and survived the communal latrine experience where privacy was a myth and small talk was optional but awkwardly loud. Now comes the part of the day everyone secretly dreads, dinner. Welcome to Roman dinner time, where feasts were excessive, famine was normal, and everything in between tasted like salt, fish sauce, or despair. Let's step into the dining hall, the sun is setting. The streets are quieter now, filled with the sound of distant barking dogs, the occasional drunk senator, and the ever-present stench of burning tallow candles. You make your way to the triclinium, the Roman dining room. It's modest if you're poor, luxurious if you're rich. Either way, there's no table, just couches. Yes, Romans ate while reclining, like they were auditioning for a role in an ancient Netflix drama. Only 3 people per couch, mind you. That's not just etiquette, it's law, or at least tradition. You lie down on your elbow trying not to spill wine all over your tunic. There's no fork, no knife, unless you brought your own. And definitely no napkin, unless you count wiping your hands on the slave girl's skirt. Because yes, if you're rich enough, someone fans you while you eat. If you're poor, you fan yourself with yesterday's stale bread. Dinner begins, and like breakfast, it starts with wine. But this time it's stronger, sweeter, sometimes even mixed with honey or spices. Because after a long day of arguing in court, managing slaves, or watching gladiators die, Romans needed something stronger than weak ale. Wine was the glue that held the empire together, along with salt, olive oil, and the threat of crucifixion. Now let's talk about what actually went on the plate. If you're poor, pottage again, a thick stew of whatever was left from the market, grains, beans, turnips, maybe some onions, if you're lucky. All boiled together into a gloopy mess that stuck to the bottom of your wooden bowl like regret. No meat, no cheese, no flavor except salt, if you could afford it. For the average Roman, dinner wasn't about taste. It was about survival. And if you're rich, well, hold on to your laurel wreath. You're about to be served roasted peacock, flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, and oysters soaked in garum, a fermented fish sauce so strong it could peel paint off walls. Garum was everywhere. In every dish, on every table, smelled like death, tasted like the sea's worst nightmare. But hey, it was protein, and protein kept you alive longer than plague. Roman elites didn't just eat food. They ate spectacle. They dined on exotic meats imported from the far corners of the empire: ostrich, camel, elephant, and once, according to legend, a whole donkey leg roasted inside a pastry crust so big it had its own gravity. Servants brought, course after course, each more absurd than the last. A roasted boar with apples in its mouth? Sure. But how about one with live birds sewn inside its belly, flying out when the crust cracked open? That's right. Roman dinner theater was wild. Some meals were soaked in perfume. Others came with music, poetry, or even philosophical debate. Because if you're going to eat pig intestines and figs, you might as well do it while quoting Cicero. But let's not forget, this is Rome. And Rome doesn't believe in moderation once. The main course is done. It's time for dessert, which, by Roman standards, means more garum, or maybe honey-drenched cakes made from wheat flour and goat milk. Fruit? Yes, but only figs, dates, or grapes soaked in wine until they turned into raisins that still somehow managed to rot your teeth. And if you thought you were safe from weird meats, oh no, Romans loved dormice, not cute little forest creatures. No, these were fat, specially bred mice raised in clay jars, stuffed with nuts and honey, then roasted until golden brown, eaten cold, of course, because refrigeration hadn't been invented yet. But fermentation had, so you munch on mouse flesh, sip your spiced wine, and try not to think about the lice crawling under your toga. Now, let's talk about how often people actually got to eat like this. Spoiler, not very. The elite feasted like gods. The poor starved like mortals. Food distribution in Rome was controlled by the state, not for health reasons, but for political ones. The famous bread and circuses policy. Real thing. Emperors gave away free grain to keep the plebs happy. Because hungry people riot. Full bellies stay quiet. So every month citizens lined up at public granaries to collect their share of wheat. But it wasn't always fair. Corruption ran rampant. Officials stole grain. Merchants diluted it with sawdust. One wrong move, and you ended up chewing on moldy flour that made your stomach scream louder than a Christian in the Colosseum. And if you weren't a citizen, too bad. Slaves got scraps. Workers got porridge. Farmers got what they could grow, and during times of war or famine, even the rich struggled because Rome was built on trade routes. And if those ships sank, the city starved. Imagine ruling an empire and suddenly being forced to eat turnip paste because pirates ate your lunch. And, let's not forget, famine wasn't rare. In fact, it was one of Rome's greatest threats. Wars disrupted supply lines. Storms wrecked shipments. Plagues killed farmers. When the food stopped coming, people got desperate. Rats disappeared from the gutters. Dogs vanished from the streets. Cats became delicacies. And yes, rumors swirled that in the worst famines, parents sold children for food, or worse. But if you were lucky enough to avoid starvation, you might have faced another danger: spoiled food, because preservation was limited to drying, salting, smoking, or burying it underground. Leftovers didn't last long, especially in summer. Meat rotted. Fish turned rancid. Bread grew mold like it was trying to evolve. And the worst offender, garum. This stuff could go bad faster than milk in a Roman bathhouse, but people kept eating it anyway because hunger makes you stupid, and Rome was full of stupid people. So whether you're rich or poor, your dinner probably involved a risk: a bite of mystery meat that may or may not have been rat, a cup of wine that might have come from a barrel stored next to dead fish, or a slice of bread that looked suspiciously like it was baked with chalk. And if you lived through it, congratulations, you're ready for bed, or at least what passes for it in ancient Rome. So, you've made it through the day. You woke up in a straw mattress full of fleas. You wiped with a communal sponge stick. You ate bread that aged you 5 years per bite. And you worked until your spine screamed for mercy. Now comes the final test. Can you survive the night? Welcome to bedtime in ancient Rome, where sleep wasn't a right. It was a privilege earned through endurance, exhaustion, and maybe a little wine. Let's begin at dusk. The sun dips behind the rooftops of Rome. The forum empties. Street vendors pack up their stalls. The scent of roasted pork and stale wine lingers in the air like a memory you can taste. Your body is sore. Your back aches. Your eyes burn from dust, sweat, and lack of lighting. But sleep, that's not guaranteed. Because tonight you're going to bed, if you have one. Most Romans didn't. Not in the way we think of beds today. If you were rich, you had a wooden frame with wool or linen mattresses stuffed with hay or feathers. If you were poor, well, let's just say you slept wherever gravity decided to stop pulling. A pile of straw, a blanket on the floor, or worse, a shared mat with your entire family, plus the neighbor's goat. Yes, animals often came inside at night, especially in poorer homes. It kept them safe from thieves, and you warm from livestock heat. And speaking of warmth, don't expect much of it. No central heating, no electric blankets, just fireplaces, oil lamps, and the occasional brazier burning low into the night. If you could afford olive oil for your lamp, great. If not, you sat in darkness, thick, heavy, and full of shadows that might be rats, or might just be your imagination playing tricks. And then there's the noise. Rome never truly slept. Snoring relatives, howling dogs, drunken senators shouting poetry off balconies, neighbors dumping chamber pots out windows with zero warning. Sleep was broken, interrupted, often stolen by life itself. But let's step into the bedroom, or what passes for it. You lie down slowly, joints creaking from labor, weather, and general medieval level wear. There's no pillow unless you count a stone slab wrapped in cloth. No sheets, no duvets, just more woolen blankets that smell like they were last washed during the reign of Emperor Augustus, which is to say, never. And bugs? Oh yes, fleas, lice, bedbugs. All of them claimed your mattress as their kingdom long before you did. Roman mattresses were basically bug farms, layers of fabric, hay, and sweat, all packed together like a microbial stew. You scratch automatically. You don't even notice anymore. It's just part of the nighttime ritual. Now imagine lying there, staring into the dark, listening to the sound of your children breathing beside you, and wondering if tomorrow will kill you faster than tonight's insects. But hey, at least you're not sleeping outside. That's right. For many Romans, especially slaves, soldiers, or the homeless, sleep meant curling up in doorways, alleyways, or under aqueducts. They used cloaks as blankets, heads resting on packs or sacks, while rats scurried over their feet and owls hooted like death watches. Even in better homes, privacy was rare. Entire families shared rooms. Servants slept near the kitchen hearth. Guests were given whatever space remained. Romans believed in community, even when it came to dreams. And if you thought your modern neighbors were loud, try living in an apartment building 5 stories high, stacked with dozens of other families, all sharing walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's toothache. At night, the city was alive with footsteps, voices, and the occasional scream. Fire, alarms, thieves, arguments, domestic violence, all part of the Roman lullaby. So you close your eyes. Or try to, because now comes the real enemy, the cold, or the heat, depending on the season. In winter, the cold crept in like a thief. Stone walls offered no insulation. Gaps between bricks welcomed wind like a guest of honor. You huddled beneath your blanket fortress, shivering so hard your teeth chattered louder than a gladiator's armor. In summer, the opposite problem. Heat trapped inside your home like a sauna gone wrong, sweat soaked into your tunic. Mosquitoes descended like tiny armies. And the only thing moving at night was the fan slave, hired to keep flies away while you prayed for unconsciousness. Yes, rich Romans had fan slaves, not to cool the room, not for comfort, just to keep insects from landing on their face while they tried to dream of conquests and chariot races. Some wealthy households even installed mosquito netting, but not for everyone. Only for the master. Everyone else? Welcome to the land of bites and fever. Now let's talk about actual sleep habits. Because yes, Romans had some strange ones. They didn't sleep straight through the night. Nope, they practiced segmented sleep. 2 periods of rest separated by a middle-of-the-night wake-up phase. During that time, people would pray, write, make love, or simply stare at the ceiling, wondering why their feet hurt so much. This wasn't insomnia. It was normal. Historians believe this pattern was common across pre-industrial societies, a natural rhythm shaped by candlelight and silence. But in Rome, that waking hour also brought danger. Burglars, fire, sudden deaths. Because if someone died during the night, the house became impure until proper burial rites were performed. So, yeah, if you woke up in the dark and found your uncle dead beside, you guess what? You weren't getting back to sleep anytime soon. And if you were lucky enough to drift off, don't think you'll stay asleep. Because in ancient Rome, dreams were optional. Nightmares were mandatory. So you've made it through the bathroom. You've wiped with a communal sponge stick, dumped your chamber pot out the window while shouting, "Guarda l'acqua," like a cursed herald, and survived the experience without getting stabbed by a jealous neighbor or crushed under a falling goat. Now it's time for something that sounds luxurious, but trust me, it's not. Welcome to the world of Roman bathhouses, where hygiene was public, privacy was non-existent, and disease spread faster than rumors in the Senate. Let's step inside. The sun is high. The city hums with life. You've finished your questionable breakfast, survived the morning grind, and now you're ready for what passes as self-care in ancient Rome. A bath. Not just any bath. A full day at the Thermae Aes home. The grand Roman bathhouse, an institution so deeply embedded in daily life that skipping it was like refusing to wear pants today. But don't get too excited. This isn't spa day, it's more like group sweat therapy, with a side of bacterial buffet. Roman bathhouses were massive complexes, built with marble, heated by underground furnaces, and fed by aqueducts that brought fresh water straight from the mountains. They had cold plunge pools, frigidarium, warm rooms, tepidarium, hot steam baths, caldarium, and yes, they were open to everyone, rich senators, poor laborers, even slaves. Though usually in separate sections, because even cleanliness had class divisions, you enter the bathhouse grounds, sandals slapping against stone mosaics, the scent of sulfur and sweat hitting you before you even step inside. There's no changing. Room like we know it. Just a small area where you strip down to your loincloth, if you're lucky, stash your clothes in a cubby, which will probably be robbed by lunch, and head into the first stage of bathing. First stop, the frigidarium. Cold pool, big splash, gasping start. Romans believed cold water closed pores and kept disease out, which, considering how much bacteria lived in those waters, seems tragically ironic. Then comes the tepidarium, the warm room. Here people lounged on heated benches, chatted about politics, traded business deals, and scratched their backs against stone walls. No soap, not in the way we think of it. Instead, Romans used oil and a curved metal tool called a strigil, scraping off grime, sweat, and parasites, like a human windshield wiper. Yes, that was the Roman version of washing up. Once covered in oil, you'd scrape yourself clean, then do it again if you wanted to impress someone later in the day. Only after all this did you finally reach the caldarium, the hot steam room. The air is thick. Sweating bricks line the floor. Pipes underfoot carry heat from the hypocaust system, an ancient form of central heating that sometimes caught buildings on fire. That's right. Some bathhouses burned down because the same system that warmed your feet also roasted your eyebrows. But let's focus on the real danger here. Other people, because unlike modern gyms, Roman bathhouses didn't have towels or lockers or anything resembling personal space. You walk into the caldarium and immediately regret it. Men are lying around, naked, sweating like pigs in a sauna. Some are being rubbed down by slaves. Others engage in behavior not meant for public eyes. A few are gambling with dice carved from bone, and somewhere nearby a goat has wandered in. No, really, some bathhouses doubled as social clubs, marketplaces, and occasionally barns. Animals weren't banned. People brought them in for trade, warmth, or companionship. So yeah, you're standing ankle-deep in water that might kill you, surrounded by strangers, possibly livestock, and definitely fleas. Because, let's not forget, these places were breeding grounds for every illness known to man. No chlorine, no filters, just stagnant water, body oils, and whatever came off your skin during strigiling. People didn't shower before entering. They entered to get clean, which meant the bath water wasn't exactly pure. It was reused, heated, left to sit, occasionally skimmed, but rarely changed. One study of Roman bathhouse residue found traces of parasites, fungal infections, and intestinal worms, all thriving in the warm, murky depths. So instead of healing your back pain, the bath may give you a rash that makes you wish for death. Still, people came every day. Because baths were more than hygiene. They were networking. They were relaxation. They were gossip central. Think of it as the Roman version of a coffee shop, only with nudity, disease, and the occasional murder. Senators met here. Merchants sealed deals over steaming basins. Philosophers debated ethics while soaking in lukewarm urine. Wait, did I say urine? Yes, urine was valuable, and in some cases, harvested. Roman bathhouses often recycled urine from the street vats, used in laundry, dyeing cloth, and even oral hygiene, because yes, Roman dentists recommended rinsing with urine to whiten teeth. And people listened, because in Rome everything had a use, even your own piss. So you leave the bathhouse feeling slightly cleaner, slightly dirtier, and absolutely exhausted. Your skin smells faintly of vinegar and sweat. Your hair feels like straw soaked in wine. Your lungs? Probably infected. But hey, at least you didn't die in the tub, because believe it or not, people did. Slippery floors led to drownings. Heat exhaustion caused heart attacks. And political rivals? Sometimes suspicious substances found in the water. Rome wasn't just dangerous outside the bath, it was deadly inside it. So you've survived the bathroom, barely. You wiped with a communal sponge stick, avoided being stabbed while defecating through an open window, and somehow made it. Through breakfast without vomiting from rancid porridge. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome. Hygiene, not glamorous spa days, not moisturizer, not even clean hair. Nope. Welcome to Roman beauty rituals, where looking good meant surviving the lice, grime, and communal urine that passed for skincare in this era. Let's start with your reflection, because yes, Romans had mirrors, but not the chrome-plated, adjustable, LED lit kind you have now. They had polished bronze, or if you were lucky, silver, small, round, with a short handle, reflective enough to know you look like death warmed over. Your face stares back at you, pale from indoor living, oily from whatever rancid animal fat you used last week as lotion, and full of despair. Your skin is cracked from wind, sunburned from field work, and probably itching from some kind of parasite. But let's move upward. Your hair, if it hasn't been shaved off by disease, war, or fashion, is thick with sweat, oil, and maybe a bit of dust. Hair was a status symbol. Long, flowing locks meant wealth and leisure. Short hair meant soldier, laborer, or recently shorn prisoner. And yes, shaving was a thing, but not with razors like today. Romans used tweezers, plucking out facial hair one follicle at a time. Ouch. Or better yet, they heated up a small knife until it was warm, then scraped their beards away like barnacles on a ship. No soap, no shaving cream, just determination and pain. Women? They wore their hair long, braided, pinned, and often covered with veils to show modesty or class. And they dyed it, not with synthetic chemicals but with crushed berries, henna, or lead-based paint that might have poisoned them. Slowly, some dyes were dangerous. Some were gross. One popular remedy involved soaking hair in pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar. Supposedly made your strands shiny. It didn't. It just made your scalp itch harder, and if you were bald, too bad. Baldness was seen as either wisdom, if you were rich, or malnourishment, if you were poor. There was no Rogaine. No transplants, no hats either, unless you counted the laurel wreath worn during festivals, which looked fancy but did nothing for sun protection. Let's talk about how you cleaned yourself between baths. Because yes, Romans bathed daily. But health wasn't the only reason. Hygiene was political, a way to control the population. The more time you spent in the baths, the less time you had to plot against the emperor. So whether you were a senator, a merchant, or a slave, you went to the baths, and when you came home, you reeked again within hours because cleaning products didn't exist. No shampoo, no conditioner, no deodorant, just water, ash, and sometimes clay rubbed into your scalp to absorb grease. Yes, that's right. Rich Romans used oils and powders to scrub their scalps, while poor Romans just dunked their heads in the Tiber River and prayed it took half the stench with it. Washing your hair wasn't about cleanliness, it was about survival, because dirty hair attracted lice. And lice weren't just annoying. They carried diseases, typhus, fever, infection, all because you couldn't wash your head properly. So what did Romans do about it? Well, some shaved. Servants scraped wax and sweat off your body with hot irons and cloth strips, early forms of depilation inspired by Egyptian trends. Legs, armpits, chests, all bare, especially among the elite. Smooth skin was a sign of wealth. If you had body hair, you were either a barbarian, a philosopher, or too lazy to care. But not everyone could afford a personal grooming slave. Most Romans lived with itchy wigs, unwashed. tresses and the occasional louse going on an adventure down their neck. And nails? Oh yeah, those things grew too, but nail polish hadn't been invented yet. Instead, Romans kept their nails trimmed using knives, teeth, or rubbing them raw against stone walls. Fancy manicures? Nope. A clean set of hands? Rare. Most people walked around with dirt under their fingernails, hardened calluses, and cracked palms that leaked blood every time they touched something sharp. And if you thought acne was a modern problem, think again. Oil glands still existed. So did stress. So did bacteria. Roman teenagers suffered from blackheads, boils, and infected pimples, especially those who worked near fires, sweating through layers of wool, and sleeping on straw soaked in wine and rodent urine. Dermatologists hadn't been invented. Neither had aspirin, so when your skin erupted into boils, you treated it with vinegar, crushed herbs, boiled pig fat, or prayers to the gods. Applying creams? Sure. If you consider boiling animal guts into a slurry and rubbing it on your face a skincare routine, animal fats, olive oil, and milk from donkeys, yes, donkey milk, were considered luxury moisturizers, because why would you buy lotion when you could rub yourself with donkey secretions instead? And if you wanted glowing skin, ladies soaked their faces in urine. Because yes, urine was everywhere, used in laundry, in mouthwash, in dyeing cloth, in preserving food, and apparently improving complexions. Urine contains ammonia. Ammonia breaks down dead skin cells and lightens discoloration. So, in theory, it worked. In practice, you smelled like a public latrine wrapped in salt pork, but hey, glowing skin is glowing skin. Now let's talk about toothpaste-free life. Because brushing your teeth was optional, if you could find a brush, Romans used twigs. Chewed ends turned into natural bristles. Some used rough fabric or fingers, dipped in ash and salt. Others went full alchemy, mixing crushed bones, eggshells, and honey into a gritty paste that stripped enamel faster than betrayal stripped trust. Still, people tried because tooth decay was brutal. By age 30, most Romans had lost multiple teeth. Their breath? Not great. Their smiles? Terrifying. And if things got really bad, well, you found a barber surgeon. He yanked out the offending molar with pliers while you screamed. No anesthesia, no painkillers, just a strong grip and hope. So next time you complain about your shampoo running out, remember the Romans. They didn't have shampoo. They had resilience, they had filth, they had bugs, and they still managed to walk into Senate meetings looking like senators. You've survived breakfast soaked in wine, work that cracked your spine like a cheap amphora, and dinner that might have killed you if your immune system wasn't already cursed by God and science. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome. The animals, because yes, you didn't live alone, not just with family, not just with strangers, not just with lice. Nope, you shared your home, and often your bed, with a menagerie of creatures that either loved you or wanted to kill you. Well, let's start with the obvious one. Dogs. Romans loved dogs. They kept them for protection, for hunting, and sometimes just for companionship. But unlike today's spoiled pups, who sleep on memory foam beds and eat grain-free kibble, Roman dogs were working animals. They guarded homes. They chased thieves. They followed soldiers into battle. And at night, they curled up beside you, licking your cracked feet and keeping warm under your moldy blanket. Some dogs even accompanied their owners to the bathhouse. Yes, a dog in the bath was more common than you'd think, but not all Romans had noble mastiffs or sleek greyhounds. Most had mutts, stray mongrels picked up off the street, or worse, rescue rats trained to chase flies out of the kitchen. Still, dogs were loyal, unlike some other members of your household. Cats were less popular than dogs in Rome, but they were still around. The Romans adopted the Egyptian tradition of feline companionship, though they never quite worshipped cats like their Nile-dwelling neighbors. Still, Cats served a purpose: rodent control. In a world where food storage meant clay jars and open shelves, mice and rats ran rampant. So Romans brought in cats to hunt them. They weren't pampered, no fancy collars, no cat trees. Just scraps, a corner of the house, and the occasional scratch from an angry mouse. Some rich households even imported exotic breeds: Persian cats, black cats, white cats with crossed eyes, and if you thought your modern cat is aloof, imagine one that lived in a villa full of slaves, pigeons, and sweaty sandals. Roman cats? They did not care about you. Birds were everywhere. Pigeons nesting in your eaves, chickens scratching at the floorboards, peacocks strutting through patrician, gardens like feathered royalty. If you were poor, you raised chickens for eggs and meat. If you were rich, you bred peacocks just to show off. And yes, birds sometimes came inside, especially in winter when the cold drove pigeons down from the rooftops and into the rafters of your home. Sometimes they'd nest in your attic, sometimes they'd land on your shoulder while you tried to read scrolls by candlelight, and sometimes they'd waste on your head because Roman pets weren't clean. They were functional, or sometimes dinner. Roasted chicken was a luxury for the lower classes. Peacock was a delicacy for the elite. Either way, if you owned a bird, it was only a matter of time before it ended up on your plate. Goats, pigs, and the living room pet now. Let's talk about farm animals in the home, because yes, many Romans didn't have separate barns. If you were poor, your goat slept beside you. Your pig grunted under the table. Your cow chewed cud in the hallway. These animals weren't just livestock. They were assets. Your entire livelihood walked around bleating and snorting. But sharing space with goats had its perks. They kept the weeds down. They gave milk. And in some cases, they warmed your feet at night. Still, imagine trying to sleep while a goat stares at you from the foot of your bed, eyes glowing in the dark, teeth chewing straw, staring, always staring. Welcome to Roman pet life. Slaves named. After Animals K, this isn't technically a pet section, but worth mentioning, because in Rome, some slaves were named after animals. Canis meant dog. Simia meant monkey. Corvus was literally crow. Your pet may have been treated better than your slave, because in Rome, humans were property too. And sometimes they were given names that reminded them of their place. Parasites, the real roommates you never asked for. Now, let's move beyond the cute stuff, because the real animals in your life aren't the ones you see. They're the ones you feel, the ones crawling, the ones biting, the ones living rent-free in your skin lice. They were everywhere, on your head, in your clothes, on your children. Roman combs were specifically designed to fight lice, with fine teeth for scraping through hair. But it was a losing battle. Hair was rarely washed. Baths were communal. Sharing was normal, so lice spread like gossip, and once they found a host, they stayed. Fleas, your mattress was basically a flea hotel. Straw, wool, and unwashed bodies made the perfect breeding ground. Fleas jumped. Fleas bit. Fleas multiplied. And unless you burned your bedding regularly, which most couldn't afford, you lived with them. Bed bugs, yes. Even in ancient Rome, though they weren't called bed bugs yet. They were just part of life. People didn't understand germs, but they understood itching, and they understood waking up covered in bites. So much so that some Roman doctors wrote about treatments involving sulfur, vinegar, and crushed herbs. Early attempts at pest control, ticks, worms, and other internal invaders. Outside the bed, ticks clung to your legs as you walked through fields. Inside, parasites invaded your gut through undercooked meat, dirty water, and unboiled vegetables. Roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, all of them wriggling through your intestines like they owned the place. Medicine said these worms came from imbalanced humors. Modern science says they came from eating raw pork and drinking river water filled with sewage. Either way, you were full of guests, and none of them paid rent. Snakes, unwanted visitors from the walls. Now imagine lying in bed, tired, sore, and ready to pass out from exhaustion. Then you feel it. Something cold, something smooth, something moving. That's right. Snakes. Rome had plenty of small snakes sneaking through cracks in walls, hiding in grain bins, or coiling up behind the couch. Some were harmless, others venomous. And in the countryside, especially during summer, snakes were a fact of life. You stepped over them. You accidentally kicked them. And sometimes you woke up to one wrapped around your leg like a jealous lover. Because in Rome, even your nightmares were literal. Mice, rats, and the midnight feast as the oil lamp burns low. You hear the sound. Scurrying, soft paws across wooden floors, whiskers brushing against stone. Yes, rats ruled the night. They ate your bread, chewed your leather shoes, drank from your wine jug. And if you were lucky, they just stole your food. If you were unlucky, they carried plague, typhoid, fever, death. But Romans didn't fear rats the way we do now. They feared mice more. Why? Because mice were messengers from the gods. Romans believed seeing a white mouse in your home meant good fortune. Black mouse? Bad luck? Brown mouse? Neutral vibes. But no matter the color, they still stole your olives and left droppings in your flour. So maybe the gods were just messing with you. Flies, the real plague carriers. And then there were the flies, everywhere, buzzing in your ears, landing on your face, crawling into your soup. They were drawn to sweat, waste, and warmth, which meant you. Roman homes had no screens, no fans, no fly swatters, just smoke from fires and hope. Some people tried to shoo them away with cloth or incense. Others gave up and learned to eat with one hand and slap their forehead with the other. And in the streets, fly clouds hovered over garbage piles like they were waiting for a feast. Because, yes, Roman cities were full of rotting food, human waste, and dead animals. Perfect conditions for insects. Conclusion, you were never alone. So whether you were rich or poor, city-born or country-bred, you were never truly alone. There was always someone or something sharing your space. A dog at your feet, a rat beneath your bed, a louse in your hair, a tick on your ankle. Even your blood had company. Because in Rome every creature had a niche. And yours was survival, at the cost of your comfort, at the price of your hygiene, at the expense of your peace. So next time you complain about your dog shedding on the couch or your cat knocking over a glass at 3 a.m., remember the Romans. They didn't just share their homes with animals, they shared their lives, their meals, their diseases, their dreams, and their worst nightmares. So you've made it through the bathroom, barely. You've survived breakfast soaked in wine, endured a day of labor that cracked your spine like an old wooden door, and now, as the sun sets over the Colosseum, you're finally ready for something soft, something warm, something human. Welcome to Roman romance, where love was less about passion and more about property. Forget dating apps. Forget Valentine's Day. Forget even whispering sweet nothings into someone's ear while holding hands under candlelight. Nope. This is ancient Rome, where marriage was a business deal, sex was a power move, and relationships were tangled in law, class, and the occasional goat sacrifice. Let's begin with what passes for romance in this world. You wake up beside someone, maybe your wife, maybe your mistress, maybe a slave who was gifted to you by your uncle last winter. It depends on how much money you have and whether you're allowed to own people. There's no pillow, no sheets, just a thin mattress stuffed with straw, possibly shared with another person or three. Love here isn't private. In fact, privacy didn't really exist at all because, yes, in many homes, families slept together in the same room. Slaves, too. Pets, if they were lucky. Even the goats had been known to sneak in during winter. But let's say you're rich enough to afford some intimacy. You're lying next to your lover, trying not to scratch the lice off your arms, wondering how people actually met before Tinder. Well, In Rome, it wasn't easy. There were no bars with awkward small talk, no clubs filled with sweating bodies, no swiping right on sweaty gladiators. Marriage was arranged. Dating? Not a thing. If you were noble, your parents picked your spouse like they were choosing livestock based on pedigree, health, and fertility. If you were poor, well, you just married whoever would have you. And if you were a woman, even worse. Your future was decided around age 12. Your husband could be twice your age, or worse, bald. But hey, at least he owned a bathhouse. That's right, the Roman version of romance often began in public baths. Men and women sometimes bathed together in the early republic, which meant flirtation was done face to face, literally. Imagine walking into a steamy pool full of strangers, trying to make eye contact without looking like you're hunting for dinner. Some wealthy Romans preferred literary seduction, reading, poetry, quoting Cicero, or writing love letters so formal they read like legal contracts. Yes, even flirting was bureaucratic. Now let's talk about what love actually meant. Because in Rome, love was not always voluntary. It came with obligations, expectations, and in many cases, ownership. For men, especially upper-class men, love was fluid. Affairs were common. Mistresses were fashionable. And sleeping with boys? Well, that was part of tradition, inspired by Greek customs. Women? Not so much. A Roman woman caught in an affair could be divorced, disowned, or even executed, because while men could sleep with anyone they wanted, slaves, servants, other men, women were expected to remain faithful, silent, and scandal-free. Love wasn't equal. It never really was. So imagine being in a relationship where one partner could do whatever they wanted and the other could lose everything for a stolen kiss behind a column. That was the Roman way. Now let's talk about weddings. Because yes, Romans did get married. But again, not in the way we think. Weddings weren't about white dresses or cake. They were about contracts. A Roman wedding was a legal agreement between two families. Witnesses signed, fathers shook hands, property changed hands, and then the bride was escorted to her new home, hopefully not sobbing the entire time. The ceremony itself was short. The symbolism, deep. One of the most important rituals was the confariatio, reserved only for the elite. It involved sacrificing a cake made from spelt to Jupiter. Yes, marriage required divine approval and also grain. After that came the torches, the procession, and the symbolic carrying of the bride over the threshold, not for romantic reasons, but to ward off evil spirits hiding in the floorboards. Then came the night, and yes, consummating the marriage was mandatory. And guess what, everyone? Knew when it happened. Servants watched. Friends waited outside the door. Some families even hired a midwife to inspect the sheets the next morning. No pressure, just a simple, public confirmation that your marriage was valid. Because in Rome, virginity was currency, and once lost, it couldn't be returned. Now, imagine being a woman in this system. You were married young. You were expected to bear children fast. And if your husband died, too bad. You either remarried quickly or became a widow, trapped in grief. And gossip. Divorce wasn't hard in Rome. In fact, it was easier than getting a haircut. All it took was a word, a note, a gesture. But for women, divorce was messy, socially damaging, politically risky. For men, it was just another Tuesday. So yes, Roman relationships weren't exactly built on mutual respect. They were built on hierarchy. And yet, despite the lack of privacy, despite the politics, despite the overwhelming presence of parasites and pigs, people still fell in love, or at least they tried. We know this because of graffiti. Yes, ancient Roman lovers carved their names into walls, wrote poems, left messages in ash-covered stones. There's even evidence of secret meetings in hidden corners of Pompeii, where couples whispered promises they couldn't fulfill in daylight. And then there were the poets, Ovid, Catullus, Pliny. They wrote about longing, heartbreak, desire, even if it was usually aimed at people they couldn't legally marry. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, basically wrote the first self-help book on seduction, telling men how to win women with flattery, wit, and gifts, which sounds charming until you remember that half of those women were already promised to someone else. Because in Rome, love was rarely free. It was tied to status. Slaves couldn't marry. Only free citizens could. And if you loved someone below your rank, too bad, because marrying beneath your station meant losing political rights. Yes, marrying a lower-class citizen could actually demote you socially, so forget Cinderella. Think more like Game of Thrones, but with togas. So, yeah, queer love was real, but not recognized, not protected, not celebrated. Still, people found ways. Now let's talk about birth control, because yes, Romans had it. Sort of. They used honey, olive oil, and vinegar as spermicides. Women inserted wool soaked in lemon juice. Some believed squatting after sex helped, and if all else failed, abortion was common, though dangerous. No anesthesia, no clinics, just herbs, sharp tools, and hope. Infanticide was also a tragic reality. If a child was born unwanted, they might be abandoned. A tragic but recorded reality in ancient times. Because in Rome, love didn't always mean raising a family. Sometimes it meant ending one before it began. Now imagine living in a world where your heart didn't belong to you, where every choice was made for you, every kiss was political, every bed was shared with society's expectations. Romans still managed to fall in love. They still kissed. They still held hands. They still mourned when someone died. But they did it quietly, because in a world ruled by emperors, gods, and gossip, love was best kept low-key. You've eaten bread that aged you 5 years per bite, worked until your spine cracked like a broken door, and somehow avoided being boiled alive by a jealous neighbor. Now comes something inevitable, something every Roman feared, and not just because of what it meant in life, but because of what came after. Welcome to Romans. Death rituals, where dying wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a whole new set of problems. Let's begin at dusk. The sun dips behind the rooftops of Rome. The forum empties. Street vendors pack up their stalls. The scent of stale beer, human sweat, and goat lingers in the air. Like a memory you can taste, you feel it before you see it. A hush in the street. A pause in the chatter. A sudden parting of the crowd. Someone has died. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's your uncle. Maybe it's even you. Because tonight we're not just talking about how Romans died. We're talking about how they feared death and how they tried to make sure the dead stayed dead. Let's start with what actually killed you. In Rome, death didn't come from heart disease or old age. It came from infection, malnutrition, plague, or getting stabbed during a political argument. Romans believed that spirits could return if not properly buried. If the body wasn't washed, wrapped, and burned, or buried, the soul might wander back into the world of the living, and no one wanted that. Because in Rome, ghosts weren't just spooky stories whispered over wine. They were real, or at least everyone acted like they were. So imagine this. You wake up in the year 127 AD, you're not alive, but you're not free either. Your funeral happened yesterday, or maybe last week. Time blurs when you're dead, but your spirit, still here, still lingering near the house, still trying to find peace. Because, yes, Romans believed in the afterlife. Not in the way we think of heaven and hell. Nope. They believed in the underworld, ruled by Pluto, in lemurs, restless spirits, that wandered at night, causing mischief and misfortune, and in omens, birds flying the wrong way, dogs howling at nothing, dreams that felt too real. So, let's talk about what happens when someone dies. First rule, don't touch the body unless you have to. Romans believed death was contagious, not physically but spiritually. A dying person was often placed near a window or on the floor so their spirit wouldn't get trapped in the bed. Once they passed, The family wailed loudly, not out of grief, but to scare away evil spirits. Yes, that's right. Screaming at the top of your lungs wasn't just emotional, it was ritual. Then came the washing. Family members, usually women, would clean the body with vinegar and water, anoint it with oils, and wrap it in linen or wool. No embalming like the Egyptians, just purification. And then the fire. Most Romans cremated their dead, at least early Romans did. Later, burial became more common, especially among Christians and wealthier families who preferred stone sarcophagi over smoke, but cremation was traditional and messy. Imagine standing beside a pyre built from wood, animal fat, and whatever herbs were available to mask the stench of burning flesh. Family and friends gather. They toss gifts into the flames, personal items, coins, toys, even food. They want you to arrive in the afterlife with everything you need, which, honestly, probably includes a better bathhouse than the one you used in life after the fire burns. Out, bones are collected and placed in a small urn. That urn goes into a tomb, a family plot, or sometimes even under the floorboards of your home. Because, yes, many Romans kept their dead close. Some homes had niches for ashes. Others had entire family crypts beneath the kitchen. Death wasn't something to be boxed up and forgotten. It lived with you, even in death. Now let's talk about the funeral procession. Because, yes, Romans knew how to throw a party. Flute players led the way. Mourners followed. Slaves carried effigies of ancestors down the street. This wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was about showing off. Rich families hired professional wailers. Poor ones made do with relatives who sobbed louder than usual. The body, or urn, was carried through the streets to the necropolis, the city of the dead, located just outside town. Why outside? Simple. Romans believed the dead polluted the living. So cemeteries were never inside cities. Graveyards lined roads like silent witnesses to history. And if you couldn't afford a fancy tomb, well, there was always mass burial pits. Yes, some poor Romans were tossed into shared graves, their bodies stacked like firewood. No names, no markers, just dirt and time. But rich Romans got monuments, grand mausoleums, stone altars carved with poetry, inscriptions warning grave robbers that the gods were watching because grave robbing was real. People stole jewelry, clothing, even bones. Some believed touching a corpse gave you power. Others thought relics could bring curses. Either way, tombs were guarded. Some even had locks. Now let's talk about what came next, the afterlife. Because unlike today, Romans didn't believe in a single eternal destination. There were several options. The Elysian Fields, reserved for heroes and emperors. The underworld, dark, cold, and full of ferry rides across the river Styx. And Orcus, basically the Roman version of hell, where sinners were punished with eternal hunger, thirst, or regret. To get to Elysium, your family had to perform the proper rites. Food offerings, wine poured onto the ground, candles lit at the household shrine, because if you were forgotten, you became a ghost, a lemur, wandering Rome streets at night, haunting houses, and bringing bad luck to anyone who didn't honor the dead. So yeah, Romans didn't just fear death. They feared what death might become. And then there's the matter of commemoration. Because once you're gone, how do you stay remembered? With inscriptions on tombstones, on walls, on public buildings, Romans loved writing about themselves. Here lies Marcus Flavius, lover of wine, husband of Livia, father of two, killer of goats. Okay, not exactly Shakespeare, but these inscriptions mattered. They proved you existed. They warned people to respect your bones. They reminded the living that death was coming for them too. And if you were really important, you got a funeral speech, delivered in the forum, often by your son or nephew, detailing your life, your virtues, your conquests, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes outright fabricated. But hey, it was the ancient world's version of a LinkedIn post. Now let's talk about what happened to the body. Cremation was common, but not universal. as time went on, burial became more popular, especially among the elite. Stone coffins, sarcophagi, were carved with scenes from mythology, often depicting battles, gods, or heroic deaths. Some even showed the deceased dining, in the afterlife still enjoying wine and pork as if they'd just taken a long nap. And if you were really rich, you got a tomb shaped like a mini temple, with statues, gardens, even fountains. Some tombs had benches, so visitors could sit and chat with the dead. Yes, Romans visited the graves of their ancestors regularly. They brought flowers, food, wine. Sometimes they just sat and talked, because in Rome, the dead never truly left. They watched, they listened, they judged. And if you disrespected them, well, don't say I didn't warn you. You've worked until your spine cracked like an old door, endured the cold of winter and the stink of summer, and managed to avoid plague long enough to make it this far. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome. Religion, not just gods on mountaintops or sacrifices at altars. Nope. In Rome, religion was everywhere. It lived in your home, in your food, in your dreams, in your fears. Welcome to Roman religion, where every act was sacred, every meal was ritual, and every sneeze was a sign from the gods. Let's begin inside your house. You wake up each morning not just sore, but spiritually behind schedule, because before you even brush your teeth with ash and vinegar, you must pray. Yes. Every Roman household had a small shrine, the lararium, usually built into the wall near the entrance. It held tiny statues of the household gods, the laras, protectors of the family line, and the penates, spirits, of food and plenty. And if you were rich enough, maybe even a bust of the emperor himself. Because yes, emperors were gods now, or at least they wanted to be. So you kneel beside your lararium, light a candle or incense, and whisper a prayer, a pinch of salt, a few drops of wine, a bit of bread offered to the fire, all part of the daily ritual, because in Rome, missing a prayer meant risking divine wrath. And divine wrath came in many forms: a sick child, a dead ox, a failed harvest, a neighbor who suddenly owns better sandals than you. Now let's talk about the bigger gods: Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Minerva, Neptune. They ruled everything, from war to trade, from love to death. Romans didn't just worship them, they bargained with them. Prayers weren't requests, they were negotiations. If I win today's argument, I'll sacrifice a chicken. If my wife gives me a son, I'll burn some incense at the temple. If I survive this goat, I'll build a statue that looks suspiciously like it. That's right. Roman religion wasn't about faith alone. It was transactional. Offerings, vows, rituals. Give to the gods, and they might give back. Fail to do so? Well, don't say I didn't warn you. Let's step into the temple. The city is already buzzing with merchants, slaves, and the occasional chariot wheel squeaking like a dying pig. You head toward the nearest temple, maybe Jupiter's grandest, one on the Capitoline Hill, maybe a smaller shrine tucked between two bakeries. Priests move around in flowing robes, muttering prayers, burning incense, and looking down their noses at commoners like you, because, yes, priests were part of the US. Elite religion wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Temples were banks, priests were bureaucrats, and gods? They were tools used by rulers to keep people obedient. Still, you enter carefully, making sure not to step on any rats, hiding beneath the floorboards. You toss a coin into the offering bowl, assuming you have coins to spare. Then you wait, because Romans believed gods answered through signs, birds flying in formation, the way smoke rose from a fire. A dog barking twice instead of once. Even dreams were considered messages from the divine. So if last night you dreamed of a black cat walking backward while humming Greek poetry, yeah, that means something. But what? Time to ask a priest or a fortune teller or a chicken. Yes, chickens were used in divination. Some were fed grain before battle. If they ate greedily, victory was certain. If they refused, Too bad, off to war anyway, because in Rome, omens mattered, but never stopped anything from happening. Now let's talk about what happened if things went wrong. Illness, misfortune, bad luck in business. What did Romans do? They didn't call a doctor. They called a priest. Medicine and magic were often the same thing. If you coughed for too long, you prayed to Asclepius, god of healing. If your tooth hurt worse than betrayal, you burned herbs to ward off evil spirits. And if all else failed, you visited a temple bathhouse dedicated to health, soaked in mineral water, and hoped the gods felt merciful. Because yes, some temples had full medical facilities. Sick people slept there overnight, hoping to dream of a cure. Some even brought offerings of body parts carved in wax, a nose, a heart, a liver, left as thank you notes in case the gods healed them. But let's not forget the big show. Public rituals, massive ceremonies, processions, blood sacrifices, dasykat, festivals like Saturnalia or Lupercalia. The whole city turned into a religious carnival. Saturnalia flipped social order upside down. Slaves got to mock their masters. Everyone wore bright colors. Drunkenness was encouraged. Lupercalia was even wilder. Half-naked men ran through the streets, whipping women with animal hide strips to ensure fertility. Yes, that was real. And it was wildly popular because in Rome, religion wasn't quiet. It was loud, bloody, and sometimes terrifying. Animal sacrifices were normal. Sheep, goats, cattle, even horses. Blood poured into stone basins. Priests chanted. The air filled with smoke and the scent of burnt fat. These weren't just symbolic acts. They were performances because gods needed proof. They needed smell, sound, death. And then there's the worst kind of divine punishment, curse tablets, found in graveyards, buried under roads, hidden in walls. These little pieces of lead were filled with curses, written in angry Latin. They asked the gods to ruin someone, to make their business fail, to curse their love life, to destroy their enemies slowly, painfully, and publicly. People cursed rivals, thieves, lovers who broke their hearts. They wrote names. They described suffering. They sealed the tablet with nails and buried it near the dead because ghosts were good middlemen. Yes, Romans believed the dead could carry messages to the underworld gods faster than a messenger on horseback. So, if you wanted vengeance, you didn't sue. You cursed, and if you were the target, good luck. Because once a curse was cast, your only hope was another prayer, and maybe a visit to a witch. Now let's talk about death. Because yes, even dying was religious. When someone passed away, the family gathered. They closed the eyes. They whispered a final prayer. Then they placed a coin on the corpse's tongue. Why? Because Karen, ferryman of the underworld, wouldn't take passengers without payment. Yes, that's right. Romans believed the soul needed a ride across the river Styx, and like any transportation system, you paid in advance. Once the body was washed and wrapped, it was carried out feet first, so the spirit wouldn't look back and get lost between worlds. Cremation was still common, especially among the elite. But the poor? They buried their dead in simple plots, sometimes with a pot or two for company, and if you couldn't afford a tomb, you got tossed into a mass grave, because in Rome, even death had class divisions. Now let's talk about what happened after you died. Did you go to heaven? Not exactly. Roman afterlife was complicated. There was Hades, there was Elysium, there was Tartarus. Heaven was for heroes, hell was for sinners. Most people just wandered the underworld forever. Unless you were really important, then you became a god. Yes, emperors were often declared divine after death. Augustus, Claudius, Hadrian, their ashes were sprinkled over altars. Temples were built, statues erected. Worshipping the dead was official policy, because in Rome, power didn't die with the body. It ascended. Now let's talk about the ultimate religious experience, the haruspices. These guys were Rome's version of fortune tellers, only grosser. Haruspuses were trained priests who read the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals. Yes, you heard that right. They sliced open sheep, pigs, or cows, then stared at the organs like modern-day stock traders watching a ticker. Liver patterns predicted war. Intestinal knots warned of famine. Gallbladder shape foretold political shifts. And if the signs were bad, well, maybe the gods didn't want you going to war today, or maybe they wanted more goats. Who knew? The Haruspuses claimed to. And no one argued with them because questioning the gods wasn't smart. Now imagine living in a world where every decision was guided by superstition, where every sneeze was a warning, where every thunderstorm was a message. Rome wasn't just religious, it was obsessed. Gods watched from every corner. Spirits haunted your sleep. Fortune tellers ruled your choices. And if you dared to question it, well, there was always the possibility you'd be accused of atheism, which, in Rome, was a capital offense, because to Romans the gods were real and doubting them, well, that was just asking for lightning to strike. You've worked until your spine cracked like an old wooden door, endured the cold of winter and the stink of summer, and managed to avoid plague long enough to make it this far. Now comes something that ruled every aspect of life in ancient Rome. Politics, but not politics as we know them today. No elections, no campaign slogans, no late-night roasts on television. Nope. In Rome, politics was more like a high-stakes board game where betrayal wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Let's begin at the top, the emperor. You wake up one morning not just sore, but politically doomed. Because, yes, in Rome, power changed hands faster than a hot potato in a senator's meeting. One day, you're dining with the emperor, sipping wine, and whispering about military campaigns. The next, you're accused of treason, or worse, bad taste in togas. Welcome to Roman politics, where loyalty is fleeting, alliances are temporary, and survival depends on how fast you can run when someone yells, "Assassination!" Let's start with the basics. Rome wasn't always ruled by emperors. At first, it had a republic. Yes, there was a senate. There were elections. There were laws, mostly ignored. But unlike modern democracy, Roman politics wasn't about votes or speeches. It was about influence and who could throw the best party. Rich senators bribed voters with food, land, or even gladiatorial games. If you wanted to win favor, you threw a good show. And if you couldn't afford a gladiator fight, at least offer free bread. Because in Rome, keeping people fed was the difference between peace and rioting mobs tearing down your statue. But then came Julius Caesar, then Augustus, and suddenly the republic became an empire. Power shifted from the people to the princeps, the first citizen, which was just a fancy way of saying guy who owns everything. From then on, the emperor ruled all. The Senate? Just there for show. Like a bunch of extras in a Shakespearean play, they nodded along while the real decisions were made behind closed doors, usually over wine, sometimes over poison. Now, let's talk about what it took to rise in Roman politics. If you were born into a powerful family, great, you had a head start. If not, well, you needed money, charm, and a willingness to backstab anyone who got too close to your ambitions. Adopting a more powerful man was common. Yes, that was a thing. Julius. Caesar adopted Octavian, who would become Augustus. Later, Trajan adopted Hadrian. Marcus Aurelius adopted Commodus. These adoptions weren't warm family moments. They were political chess moves, a way to claim legitimacy without actually being born into the right bloodline. But adoption only went so far. Once you were in charge, the real danger began, because in Rome, ruling meant waiting for someone to try and kill you. Yes, emperor after emperor met their end not in battle, not of old age, but by dagger in the back. Some were stabbed in the Senate, others were poisoned during dinner, a few were smothered under their own bathrobe by a jealous heir. And some were simply dropped into a sewer shaft by a rival with better timing and worse intentions. Let's look at a few examples. Caligula, the madman in sandals, started out popular but ended up believing he was a god. He declared war on Neptune, ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as war trophies, and allegedly slept with his sisters. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard decided he'd gone too far. They assassinated him in a public corridor, stabbed him over and over, and left his body in a dumpster until his uncle Claudius took over. Claudius himself was underestimated because of his limp and speech impediment. But he played the game well until his wife Agrippina decided she'd rather have her son Nero on the throne than her husband, so she poisoned him with mushrooms. Classy touch. Then came Nero, who fiddled while Rome burned, blamed Christians for the fire, and eventually committed suicide after the army turned against him. Domitian built massive palaces, lived in paranoia, and had spies everywhere, including his own dinner table. Still, he didn't see the knife coming until it was too late. Commodus, the guy who thought he was Hercules reincarnated, spent his time fighting gladiators, sleeping with concubines, and changing his name to Hercules Commodus. His reign ended when his mistress conspired with the wrestler Narcissus to strangle him. During a bath, that's right, an emperor died by pillow-fisted chokehold. Because in Rome, power didn't protect you from betrayal. It invited it. Now imagine living in a world where your closest ally could be your killer, where a smile might hide a plot, where even your personal doctor might be writing recipes for death instead of healing. This wasn't just politics, it was theater, bloody, dramatic, full of backstabbing and betrayal, and guess what? Even the common people played the game, because yes, plebeians weren't just spectators, they were pawns, used by politicians to chant your name in the streets, to riot if you lost favor, to demand your execution if your policies failed. Foy, mob could crown you or tear you apart, literally, and once you were dead, your memory was erased. Senators voted to remove your face from statues, your name from records, your legacy from history. It was called damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory, the ultimate punishment, not exile, not crucifixion, just complete erasure. Imagine being forgotten so thoroughly that your enemies tried to pretend you never existed. That was Roman politics. And now let's talk about how the average person dealt with all this chaos. Because yes, even if you weren't a senator or an emperor, politics still ruined your day. Taxes were set by decree. Food. Prices were controlled by the state. Jobs were assigned based on class. And if you were poor, you were lucky if you got grain, because the famous bread and circuses system was real. Emperors kept the lower classes distracted with free food and entertainment, not out of kindness, but fear. Hungry people revolted. Happy people stayed quiet. Gladiatorial fights, chariot races, beast hunts, and public executions became the Roman version of Netflix. And the more violent the show, the better. Politics wasn't just about law. It was about spectacle. And if you were smart, you knew how to read the signs. A new emperor meant new taxes. A war meant higher prices. A famine meant riots. And a scandal? Well, that meant job opportunities for the right informants, because in Rome, denouncing someone else was often the fastest way to get ahead. Informers thrived. They reported crimes, rumors, even dreams that suggested treason. Yes, dreams. If someone dreamed of the emperor dying, they could be charged with conspiracy, because in Rome, even your subconscious was political. Now, let's talk about the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most dangerous fan club. Originally the emperor's bodyguard, they soon realized they could pick and choose rulers like they were shopping for robes. They killed emperors. They installed new ones. They auctioned off the throne like it was a horse at market. Yes. After Pertinax was murdered in 193 AD, the Praetorians literally sold the imperial title to the highest bidder. His name was Didius Julianus. He bought the throne like a cursed lottery ticket and ruled for just 2 months before being executed on the steps of the palace. because even if you paid for the job, Rome didn't promise job security. Now, imagine trying to navigate all this as a woman, because women weren't officially in politics, but many were behind the scenes. Agrippina the Younger shaped emperors. Livia, wife of Augustus, was rumored to control policy through whispers and wine. And Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, held court, advised generals, and possibly ran the empire during her husband's absences. Women couldn't rule openly, but they could rule through influence, through poison, through marriage, and sometimes through sheer willpower. Because in Rome, power didn't always come from titles. Sometimes it came from knowing which cup to avoid, which friend to trust, which rumor to spread, and which emperor wouldn't live to see next week. You've wiped with a communal sponge stick, avoided being crushed by falling waste, and somehow made it through breakfast without vomiting from rancid porridge. You've worked until your spine cracked like an old wooden door, endured the cold of winter and the stink of summer, and managed to avoid plague long enough to make it this far. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome. The people who did all the work, because, yes, in Rome, half the population was enslaved. From housemaids to gladiators, from tutors to field hands, from cooks to secretaries, if someone wasn't free, they were likely owned. Welcome to Roman slavery, where human life had a price tag, freedom was rare, and survival depended on how much your master liked you. Let's begin at dawn. You wake up not in a bed, but on a straw mat in a corner of the kitchen, curled beside a goat and a child who isn't yours. Your body aches from yesterday's labor, scrubbing floors, carrying amphorae, and fanning your master while he ate figs and complained about the weather. There is no alarm clock, no rooster even, just the sound of sandals slapping stone, followed by a shout. Up, move! Yes, that's your morning call. No coffee, no tea, definitely no croissants. Just another day as property, because in Rome, slavery wasn't just for the poor or the conquered. It was everywhere. Rich men kept dozens. Middle-class homes had at least one. Even small shops had slaves working behind the counter, and your job depended entirely on what your owner needed. If you were lucky, you worked indoors, tutoring children, managing finances, or serving wine at banquets. If you weren't, you were out in the fields, sweating under the Mediterranean sun, chained to a plow, or branded with your master's initials. Slaves came from every corner of the empire, captured in war, sold into bondage by desperate families, or born into servitude. They were Greek scholars, German warriors, African traders, British prisoners of war, all of them stripped of freedom. Some were treated well. Some were beaten daily, but all of them shared one thing: they didn't own themselves. Now let's talk about what life was really like. Because in Rome, being a slave wasn't just about labor, it was about control, about fear, about knowing that any misstep could lead to death. Slaves lived under constant supervision. They were watched, monitored, and punished for the smallest mistakes. A spilled cup of wine, whipped, a broken clay pot, whipped harder, talking back. That's a one-way ticket to the mines. Or worse, the arena. Yes, some slaves were forced to fight as gladiators, not because they wanted glory, because their masters decided they deserved death or entertainment. Others were sent to the countryside, forced to work under brutal conditions in large estates called latifundia, where gangs of slaves toiled under the sun, harvesting olives, pressing grapes, or herding goats. These plantations were the Roman version of prison labor camps. No rest, no reward, just exhaustion, disease, and early death. But city slaves, especially those in wealthy households, had a different kind of hell. They served senators, patricians, and emperors. Some were trusted with vast sums of money. Others were locked in chains at night to prevent escape. And if you thought privacy was bad for free Romans, try living without it entirely, because in Rome, slaves slept wherever space allowed, sometimes in basements, sometimes in hallways, often in the same room as their owners. You bathed with them, you dined near them, you shared your secrets with them, and prayed they wouldn't report you to the wrong person, because, yes, many slaves were informants, paid off by their masters, to spy on other servants, on wives, on visiting politicians. Trust was dangerous. One word whispered to the wrong ear, and suddenly you're accused of conspiracy, and that's a death sentence. Now, let's talk about how you got there in the first place, because not all slaves were criminals or prisoners of war. Some were born into it, others were sold by their parents during hard times, or kidnapped by pirates, or abandoned as infants and raised by traders. Slavery wasn't a punishment. It was a fact of life. And in Rome, slaves were currency, traded in markets, bought and sold like furniture. Prices varied. A skilled scribe might cost more than a common soldier. A beautiful girl fetched high prices in brothels. An educated Greek tutor was worth his weight in silver, and once you were purchased, you became your master's property. Legally, you had no rights, no voice, no future unless you earned manumission, freedom granted by your owner, which brings us to the one hope most slaves held on to, freedom. Not always possible, but sometimes earned. Romans practiced widespread manumission, the formal release of a slave. Sometimes it happened after years of loyal service. Sometimes it was written into a will. Other times, slaves paid for their own freedom, saving coins from tips, side jobs, or extra duties. This was called peculium, a system where slaves could accumulate money, then buy their way out of bondage. But it wasn't easy. Your master could refuse, or double the price, or simply take the money and keep you anyway. Still, some made it. Once freed, former slaves became freedmen, full citizens able to marry, start businesses, and even vote in certain assemblies. But freedom didn't erase the past. Freed slaves were still considered inferior to freeborn citizens. They couldn't run for office, couldn't hold high rank, but they could build lives, and some did. Wealthy former slaves opened shops, hired other slaves, became patrons of the very class that once owned them. Yes, Rome had ex-slave millionaires, but these were exceptions. Most never saw freedom, and many died before they had the chance. Now let's talk about rebellion, because yes, slaves fought back. Spartacus is the most famous, and for good reason. He led a massive revolt that terrified Rome for 2 years, but he wasn't the only one. In Sicily, slaves rose up twice, burning cities, killing landowners, and declaring themselves kings. In Athens, slaves fled into the hills and formed armed bands. Even in Rome itself, whispers of mutiny spread like wildfire. But every uprising ended the same way, with blood. The Romans didn't negotiate. They crucified rebels, thousands of them, alongside roads, nailed to trees, left to rot in the sun. It was a warning. Don't test us, because if you rise, we'll kill you slowly. And yet, despite the cruelty, slaves were woven into every part of Roman life. They taught children, cooked meals, ran businesses, built monuments, even advised generals. Some were smarter than their masters. Some were more powerful than senators. Because, yes, Roman emperors used slaves as advisors, secretaries, and even lovers. Augustus had them. Nero loved them. Trajan promoted them. And some slaves rose so high they practically ruled the empire. Narcissus, a slave-turned-imperial advisor, helped Claudius become emperor. Pallas, another slave-turned-banker, controlled the finances of the state. These men didn't just survive slavery. They thrived in it until they were freed, and even then they kept influence, because in Rome, power didn't always come from birth. Sometimes it came from surviving long enough to earn trust. Now let's talk about family, because yes, slaves had relationships. Some married other slaves. Some were forced together by their masters. Children born to slaves were also slaves. property passed down like furniture. And if you were a woman, well, your body wasn't yours either. Sexual abuse was common. Masters took concubines from their household slaves. Overseers raped farm workers. There was no protection, no recourse. Just endurance, because in Rome, the law said your body belonged to your owner. Now, imagine living like that, knowing every part of you, your time, your energy, your body, wasn't yours to command. Every meal you cooked, you didn't eat. Every floor you cleaned, you didn't sleep on. Every coin you handled, you didn't spend. And every decision you made had to be cleared by someone else. That was the reality of Roman slavery. It wasn't just cruel, it was total. A complete erasure of autonomy, and yet despite everything, slaves shaped Rome. They built its roads, raised its children, fed its elite, fought in its wars. Without them, the empire would have collapsed because Rome ran on slavery, its economy, its politics, its culture. And when slavery finally faded centuries later, Rome itself began to crumble because empires built on human suffering can only stand as long as the suffering continues, and once that foundation cracks, everything falls apart. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome: crime, and more importantly, punishment. Because in Rome, breaking the law wasn't just about fines or jail time. It was about pain, public pain. Pain designed not just to punish, but to terrify. Welcome to Roman crime and punishment, where justice was theater, cruelty was tradition, and mercy was for the gods. And even then, only if you bribed them properly. Let's begin at dawn. The city is already alive with merchants shouting prices, donkeys braying under the weight of produce, and the occasional drunk senator stumbling home after a night of wine-soaked betrayal. But beneath the surface of daily life, another side of Rome thrives: crime. Rome had thieves, pickpockets, prostitutes, gamblers, fraudsters, even con artists who sold fake relics from Jupiter's temple. Yes, in a city of over 1 million people, crime was inevitable, and so was the response, because in Rome, punishment wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about example setting, about making sure everyone knew what happened when you crossed the wrong line. Let's say you stole a loaf of bread, or maybe a pair of sandals. Maybe you owed someone money. Maybe you looked at a senator's wife the wrong way. Too bad, you're now on trial. And no, there were no lawyers, no jury, just a judge, a crowd, and your ability to beg convincingly. If you were rich, you hired a rhetorician, basically a speechwriter who could turn your crime into a sob story. If you were poor, you stood before the magistrate, barefoot, probably half naked, and prayed that your tears would move him more than your guilt did. Because yes, judges in Rome were real people, sometimes senators, sometimes emperors, sometimes local officials, with a taste for blood, and their verdicts, final, merciless, creative. Now, let's talk about the punishments themselves, because in Rome, prison wasn't really a thing. Jail was temporary, a holding cell, a place to rot until your sentence came down. Then came the real deal. There were 4 main ways Rome dealt with criminals: exile, fines, slavery, death, and if you thought death was the worst, think again, because in Rome, dying was just the start. Let's start with exile. This was the light version of punishment. If you were lucky, you lost citizenship. You couldn't own property. You couldn't vote. And if you returned, well, see option number 4. Fines were common, especially among the elite. Corruption, rampant. If you had money, you paid your way out of trouble. Done. If not, back to exile. Or worse. Now we get to slavery. That's right. Some crimes didn't end in death. They ended in ownership, thieves, fraudsters, some political prisoners, all sent to work the mines, the fields, the kitchens. No rights, no voice, just chains and labor until you dropped. And finally, death. Oh yes, Rome had a menu of options, each one more creative than the last. Here are just a few. Crucifixion, reserved for slaves, rebels, and anyone who dared challenge authority. Gladiator fights, throw the criminal into the arena, let them die fighting beasts or other convicts. Beastly deaths, lions, bears, crocodiles. All-star lineup of ancient predators waiting for their next meal, burning alive, for arsonists or witches, or people who annoyed the emperor too much, drowning, thrown into a river or the sea, sometimes while chained to rocks to ensure they stayed dead. Decapitation, fast, clean, and usually reserved for nobles or senators who had the decency to commit suicide before execution, thrown off a cliff, literally. Tarpeian Rock was Rome's favorite shortcut to death. One push and suddenly you weren't just guilty, you were airborne. Impalement. Some versions of Roman justice used stakes, spikes, and slow, agonizing death as a public spectacle. Boiling alive. Well, yes, Romans did that too, especially during later imperial reigns. Imagine being lowered slowly into scalding water while the crowd cheers. Live burial. Not just a medieval thing. Romans buried traitors, spies, and witches alive in rare cases, sealing them behind walls, or dropping them into pits with minimal air. But the worst part? These weren't done quietly. They were performed in public entertainment, a warning, a message carved in blood and bone. Now let's talk about what got you killed, because yes, Roman law was brutal, but also specific. Some crimes were capital, offenses. Others just led to exile, torture, or forced labor. Here's a short list of things you shouldn't do in Rome. Commit treason. Plotting against the emperor meant certain death, usually by sword or poison. Poison someone, ironically poisoning was often punished by poison. Steal from the state, tax fraud, corruption, or mismanaging funds meant exile or execution. Blasphemy. Offending the gods or disrespecting religious rites was grounds for death. Adultery. If you were a woman caught cheating, your fate depended on your husband. He could kill you, he could divorce you, he could sell you into slavery. Being a Christian, during periods of persecution, followers of Christ were tossed into the Colosseum, set on fire, or crucified upside down. Murder, depending on class. Murder could be settled with a fine, exile, or execution. Sedition, stirring up rebellion, meant death, often in front of thousands of spectators. Forgery. Forging documents, coins, or wills was a hanging offense. Fraud, swindling people, meant exile, or worse, forced labor in the salt mines. And if you thought police brutality was modern, guess again. Roman authorities didn't have cops, they had soldiers, city guards, even private bounty hunters, and if you ran, they hunted you, with dogs, with swords, with torches, because in Rome, running from justice just meant you died tired. Now let's look at the legal system, because yes, Rome did have laws, lots of them. Over time, Rome developed a sophisticated legal code, but enforcement was inconsistent. Laws varied between classes. Slaves couldn't sue. Women had limited rights. Citizens had more protections than non-citizens. And trials? More like performances. Accusations were made in public, witnesses shouted, lawyers argued in dramatic tones, judges ruled based on reputation, politics, and how much influence your family had. Because in Rome, truth wasn't always the goal. Power was. Now let's take a look at the ultimate crime. Treason. Treason was the fastest ticket to death. Plotting against the emperor, spreading rumors, owning forbidden books, all counted as treason. Emperor Tiberius once executed a man for failing to rise when he entered the room. Caligula had people killed for clapping too loudly at the wrong moment. Nero banned criticism, real or imagined, and had informants everywhere. So if you said the wrong thing in the wrong company, you were doomed, and doom in Rome meant suffering. One of the most infamous examples is Seneca, Nero's former advisor. He was ordered to commit suicide. His wrists were cut. He bled out slowly in his bath while writing poetry, because even in death, Roman elites tried to maintain dignity. Others weren't so lucky. Cassius and Brutus, Caesar's killers, were tracked down, cornered, and forced to kill themselves rather than face capture. And in one particularly cruel case, Emperor Domitian had a poet named Martial exiled for writing satire that mocked the court. Martial didn't return. He died alone, forgotten, and bitter, because in Rome, words could be deadly. Now let's talk about women and the law. Because in Rome, justice wasn't equal. Women could be sentenced for adultery, witchcraft, or speaking out of turn. Some were whipped, others drowned. Some were locked away in isolation chambers for years. And if you were accused of witchcraft, you might find yourself burned alive or buried up to your neck and left to starve. Because, yes, live burial was a form of punishment in Rome, too. Imagine being shoved into a narrow space, barely big enough to breathe, hands bound behind your back, knees bent, spine curled in unnatural ways. A wooden lid slams shut. Dirt rains down above you, thudding like a war drum counting down your final minutes. There's no escape artist here, no chance of clawing your way out. Your nails break. Your fingers bleed. Your lungs burn. Eventually you stop screaming because there's no one to hear you. And then you wait. For hours, days, sometimes even weeks, depending on how deep they buried you, how much air got trapped inside, and how strong your will to live really is. Historians debate how often it was used, but records exist. Across cultures and centuries, rulers ordered criminals to be buried alive as a public spectacle, a warning carved in dirt and dust. And in Rome, it was occasionally used for high-profile traitors or heretics. Because in Rome, power didn't always come from swords. Sometimes it came from stripping women of the very things that defined their femininity, their bodies, their dignity, their voice. And once you'd been mutilated like this, you didn't speak out again. You didn't argue with your husband. You didn't challenge the priest. You disappeared, bruised, broken, silent. So next time you complain about modesty, privacy, or fashion, remember the breast ripper and thank whatever God you believe in that your body is your own. Now back to Roman crime. What about theft? Street robbery was rampant. Pickpockets thrived in crowded markets. Thieves broke into homes using iron tools and rope ladders, but stealing from temples. That was a death sentence, touching sacred ground, stealing offerings, defacing statues of gods or emperors, all punishable by death. And if you thought prisons existed, only briefly. Most criminals were held in small cells until their sentencing. No. Rehabilitation, no appeals, just waiting to die or suffer, and if you were lucky enough to survive the initial punishment. Don't get excited. Survival wasn't part of the plan. Once unearthed, most victims were already half-mad, dehydrated beyond repair, or permanently damaged from lack of oxygen. Even if you lived, you didn't recover. Your mind stayed fractured. Your lungs never healed. Your body remembered the pressure of the earth long after you escaped it. So next time you complain about tight spaces, claustrophobia, or bad traffic jams, remember live burial and thank whatever God you believe in that you don't have to experience it. Now comes something most people don't think about when they imagine ancient Rome. How did people entertain themselves? Because yes, in a world of war, politics, and public executions, Romans still needed a way to unwind, but not with Netflix, not with stand-up comedy. Nope. Welcome to Roman entertainment, where the only thing louder than the crowd was the sound of a man getting eaten by a lion. Let's step into the Colosseum. The sun is high, the arena is packed. Nobles fan themselves on elevated platforms while the poor cram into standing room-only sections that smell like sweat, wine, and despair. You're lucky if you got a seat, and even luckier if you didn't pay for it. Because yes, Roman games were free, paid for by emperors, senators, or rich citizens trying to win favor with the people. Think of it as the original form of social media clout. Entertainment wasn't just fun, it was political, and deadly. There were two main forms of public spectacle: gladiator fights, beast hunts, venations, and both were designed to keep the masses distracted, entertained, and obedient. Because let's face it, if you gave people bread and blood, they wouldn't riot, at least not right away. Now imagine sitting in the stands, sipping watered-down wine, watching two men walk into the sand-covered floor of the Colosseum. They bow to the emperor, or at least the empty box where he might be sitting. Then comes the signal. Oh, thumb turns downward, a hand waves, a nod from a bored senator who probably wants lunch more than justice. And then the fight begins. Swords clash, sand flies, blood sprays. One man dodges, one man falls, and the crowd roars like wolves scenting prey. Yes, that was the heart of Roman entertainment, violence sold as sport. Gladiators weren't just slaves. Some were prisoners of war, others were criminals sentenced to die by combat, and some volunteers. Volunteers, men who signed up to be trained, branded, and possibly killed, all for fame, fortune, or freedom, because winning enough fights could earn a gladiator his rudies, a symbolic sword blade handed down by the editor of the games. Once retired, former fighters opened schools, became bodyguards, or lived out their days nursing wounds. That never quite healed, but most didn't survive. Most died in the arena, hacked apart by better trained opponents or mauled by wild beasts dragged in from Africa just for the occasion. Now let's talk about what happened when swords weren't enough. Enter the venatio, beast hunt. This wasn't just lions versus Christians. It was elephants against bulls, bears against deer, tigers against dogs, and sometimes all of them against humans. Romans imported animals from across the empire: giraffes, crocodiles, rhinos, hippos, all slaughtered for show. Imagine the roar of a trapped lion echoing off stone walls, the shriek of a bear cornered in a cage, the thud of an elephant stepping onto the arena floor, confused, terrified, and seconds away from dying. These hunts were elaborate. Doors opened, traps released, animals burst into the arena, and the crowd cheered. Because in Rome, nature existed to be conquered, and death, well, death was content. Now let's talk about the stars of the show, the gladiators. They came from every background. Some were slaves, some were prisoners, some were volunteers looking for a second life. Gladiatorial schools trained them in brutal detail, how to dodge, how to kill, how to perform. Because yes, this wasn't just about survival, it was about showmanship. A good fighter knew how to draw out the suspense, to play dead until the last second, to make the audience gasp before delivering the final blow. And the best ones, they became celebrities, rich, famous, desired. Some won their freedom. Others stayed for the fame, the coin, the women. Because, believe it or not, female gladiators existed too. Rare, controversial, but real. Women fought in the arena, not often, but enough to shock the Senate. They were called ludia, and records suggest they battled each other with swords and shields, drawing the same cheers and disgust as their male counterparts, because in Rome, nothing was sacred, nothing was safe, and nothing was off-limits when it came to entertainment. Now let's move beyond the Colosseum, because Roman fun didn't stop at killing people and animals. Nope. There were also chariot races, held in the Circus Maximus, a stadium that could hold over 200,000 spectators. Horse races weren't just sport. They were religion, politics, war. Fans formed factions, the blues, the greens, reds, and whites, and riots broke out over race results. Yes, people died because their team lost, and charioteers were treated like modern-day athletes, adored, paid well, and often buried with honors. But unlike today's sports stars, these racers had a life expectancy measured in months. Crashes were common, legs shattered, spines snapped. Horses trampled their riders, and yet the crowds came back every day. because in Rome, drama wasn't just found in the Senate, it was found in the dirt, in the blood, in the sand. Now let's talk about theater, because yes, Romans loved plays. Too, though not the kind with Shakespearean soliloquies and tragic lovers. No. Roman theater was filled with satire, slapstick, and scandal. Comedy ruled the stage, insults flew. Political jokes were sharp enough to cut. Plautus wrote plays filled with trickery, mistaken identity, and clever servants outsmarting fools in power. Seneca wrote tragedies, bloody, dark, full of ghosts and revenge. And actors, they were looked down upon socially, but worshipped by the masses, because in Rome, talent mattered less than class. Actors were often ex-slaves, freedmen, or foreigners, but they were rock stars, and some were even spies, because yes, actors moved between cities, met powerful people, and whispered secrets under the cover of performance. Now, let's talk about music, because yes, Romans had bands, flutes, lyres, drums, and singers filled the streets, temples, and taverns. Weddings had live music. Funerals had mournful dirges. Gladiators marched into battle with horns blaring like ancient war playlists. Music wasn't just for joy, it was for control. And speaking of control, there was also poetry. Yes, Romans loved reciting poetry, especially in public forums, bathhouses, and dinner parties. Ovid wrote love poems so seductive they got him exiled. Catullus wrote passionate verses about forbidden relationships. Virgil told the story of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who founded Rome's legacy. Poetry wasn't just art. It was rebellion. And poets, sometimes executed, because in Rome, words could be dangerous. Now let's return to the big shows, because the ultimate form of Roman entertainment wasn't just gladiators or races, it was naumachii, naval battles staged inside flooded arenas. Yes, Romans built massive pools, filled them with water, and reenacted famous sea battles with real ships, real soldiers, and real death. Thousands of men would fight in these mock naval wars, drowning, stabbing, burning, and the audience ate it up. Because in Rome, even history was performed. Now imagine being forced to entertain, because not everyone chose to perform. Slaves, prisoners, and condemned criminals were thrown into the arena for punishment. Some were dressed as mythical figures, Hercules, Theseus, Achilles, and forced to die dramatically. Others were tied to stakes and set on fire to light the night. Or worse, dressed as animals and hunted by trained gladiators. This was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, and it was one of the cruelest deaths imaginable. Lions, bears, leopards, crocodiles, all brought in from Egypt, Libya, and the wild corners of the empire. They were starved before each event, made hungrier, more vicious, and when the gates opened, you ran or you prayed, because once the animals were loose, there was no mercy, only screams, only blood, only the thunder of paws and the silence of death. So next time you complain about streaming, services going offline, or TikTok stealing your attention span, remember Roman entertainment where the only thing louder than the crowd was the sound of a man getting eaten by a tiger. You've survived breakfast soaked in wine, endured a day of labor that cracked your spine like an old wooden door, and somehow avoided plague long enough to make it this far. Now comes the final truth about life in ancient Rome. It was exhausting, it was smelly, and most of all, it was boring. Welcome to the end of our journey, where we look at what daily life was really like for the average Roman. Not emperors, not senators, not generals, just regular people trying to survive another day in one of history's most demanding civilizations. Let's begin with the big picture. You wake up every morning covered in lice, sleeping on a straw mattress that smells like a goat's armpit, and sharing your bed with 3 cousins, 2 goats, and possibly a runaway slave who just needed a place to crash. There is no privacy, no personal space, no separation between work, home, and family drama. Because in Rome, everyone lived together. Rich or poor, free or enslaved, your life was communal. Your toilet shared, your bath shared, your food often shared. Even your death might be public if you died in the arena. Rome wasn't just a city. It was a pressure cooker of sweat, ambition, and parasites. And yet, people still found joy in it. They kissed under aqueducts. They wrote love poems on wax tablets. They drank too much at dinner parties and insulted each other in Latin. But let's not romanticize it, because in Rome, even the good parts came with risk. Now imagine living in a world where your survival depended on how fast you could run from disease, how often you prayed to Jupiter, and how lucky you were to not get stabbed over a sausage. Yes, that's right. Rome wasn't just built on law, language, and conquest. It was built on sheer endurance. Every day was a fight against infection starvation, heat-cold noise, polit icis slavery death. And yet, despite everything, Romans kept going. They farmed. They built roads. They raised children. They loved. They argued. They gossiped. And they did it all while wearing wool tunics in 90-degree heat and drinking wine because water tried to kill them. So here's the real story of Rome. Not the marble statues. Not the epic battles. Not the grand speeches in the Forum. Nope. The real Rome was full of smelly streets, leaky roofs bad, teeth-worse food, overpriced sandals, and neighbors who literally threw their waste out the window without warning. Yes, that's right. Romans didn't have plumbing like we do today. They had aqueducts, they had fountains, they had public baths. But inside homes, most people relied on clay pots, chamber pots, and open gutters that led straight into the street. If you lived on the upper floors of an insula, a 5-story apartment block, you were basically paying rent to fall to your death. These buildings were poorly constructed, shaky, fire-prone, and filled with strangers who borrowed your shoes without asking. And yes, falling off your balcony was a common cause of death. But hey, at least you got a funeral, assuming you weren't tossed into a mass grave or forgotten by time, because in Rome, memory wasn't guaranteed, only suffering was. Now let's talk about what happened when you finally got some rest, because sleep in Rome wasn't peaceful. It was interrupted. Romans believed in segmented sleep, 2 rounds of slumber separated by a middle-of-the-night waking period. During that time, people prayed, read, whispered secrets, or made love quietly in the dark. No alarms, no clocks. Just candlelight, roosters, and slaves tapping on your door to remind you work starts at sunrise. Which brings us to the final truth. You never truly owned your time. From dawn to dusk, Rome demanded something from you: taxes, labor, loyalty, worship, silence. You gave blood to the state, sweat to the soil, wine to the gods, and in return, a roof. Barely, a meal, sometimes a chance at life. Maybe. Because being Roman wasn't easy. You were constantly watched, constantly taxed, constantly reminded that the emperor owned more than your taxes. He owned your future. And if you were a woman, forget freedom. You married early, gave birth often, endured pain silently, and hoped not to die during childbirth, which statistically you probably did. If you were a child, you worked until your bones grew crooked. If you were a slave, you served until you dropped. If you were rich, you still had to worry about poison, because yes, in Rome, betrayal was as common as wine and worse tasting, and if you thought you'd escape danger by simply staying quiet and minding your business, too bad. Quiet lives still ended in the arena, still drowned in sewers, still burned alive in the Colosseum lights, because in Rome, safety was temporary, power was louder than truth, and survival meant knowing when to bow, when to drink, and when to run. So next time you complain about your job, your commute, or your Wi-Fi cutting out during a meeting, remember the Romans. They built an empire on sweat, slavery, and scabies. They fought wars with swords and sandals. They ruled the known world with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no deodorant. And somehow, they lasted over 1,000 years. So, yeah, maybe the Roman Empire didn't fall. Maybe they just collapsed from exhaustion, because surviving Roman life wasn't just hard, it was heroic in its own way. Stay tuned for more deep dives into history's most overlooked truths. Until then, sleep well or don't, because in Rome, even dreams were dangerous.